Welcome to our deep dive into the stories maybe you were never meant to hear. When you think of the Kennedy family, you probably picture the dazzling smiles, the political triumphs, the almost mythical era of Camelot. It's a tale of privilege, influence, and relentless striving that reads like a great American novel. But every great novel has its hidden chapters, the ones filled with heartbreak, sacrifice, and secrets so dark they were deliberately buried. This is the American dream inverted, a story where unimaginable success walks hand in hand with unspeakable sorrow. It's a saga that echoes the great tragedies of history, a tale of a house that flew so close to the sun that its wings were destined to melt. Today we're turning the page to those forgotten stories. We'll explore the lives of the Kennedy children who didn't fit the perfect mold, whose fates were shaped not by triumph, but by tragedy, scandal, and the crushing weight of a name they were born to carry. This is the story of the Kennedys who were lost, hidden, or broken by the very dynasty they were meant to uphold. From a secret lobotomy that erased a daughter's mind to the inherited trauma that consumed a generation, we'll uncover how the relentless pursuit of perfection came at an unimaginable price. Let's begin by painting a picture of the world that created these lives. Imagine early 20th century America, a nation brimming with industrial energy and raw ambition. It was in this crucible that Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the son of an Irish-American politician, forged a colossal fortune and an even greater ambition: to see his son become president of the United States. His drive was intensely personal, fueled by the sting of social rejection he had experienced as an Irish Catholic trying to break into the Protestant-dominated world of Boston's elite. He was denied entry to their exclusive clubs and looked down upon by the city's old money establishment. This created in him a burning desire not just to join them, but to beat them at their own game. His children would be his vindication. He and his wife, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, presided over a family that was less a home and more a training ground for greatness. This wasn't a place for quiet reflection or tender nurturing. It was an arena. Joe Sr. famously instilled in his children the motto, "We don't want any losers in this family." He would openly rank them based on their achievements, fostering a relentless environment where sibling rivalry was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged. Dinner table conversations were structured like debates, with the children expected to discuss current events and defend their positions, all under their father's critical eye. Even leisure was a competition. Joe Sr. would hold chalk talks on finance and politics, expecting his children to absorb his lessons on how the world truly worked. Competition was the air they breathed. Excellence was the only acceptable standard. In the bustling Kennedy compounds at Hyannisport in Palm Beach, the 9 Kennedy children were raised with an ironclad sense of duty and the unwavering belief that they were destined for power. Rose, the family's devoutly Catholic matriarch, was the enforcer of discipline and morality. She managed the household with meticulous precision, using a system of index cards to track each child's health, education, and even their dental appointments. While Joe Sr. pushed them towards worldly success, Rose pushed them towards spiritual perfection, insisting on daily religious instruction and impeccable manners. She dreamed of her daughters marrying into European royalty and her sons becoming paragons of Catholic virtue. This dual pressure, Joe's raw worldly ambition versus Rose's demand for respectable spiritual polish, left little room for human error or personal weakness. But this relentless drive for a perfect public image created immense pressure, and for those who couldn't keep pace, the consequences were devastating. 2 of the eldest children would become the first, and perhaps most profound casualties of this dynastic dream. Long before the world knew the name John F. Kennedy, all eyes were on his older brother, Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. Known as Joe Jr., he was the crown prince, the one groomed from birth to fulfill his father's ultimate ambition. He was everything his father wanted in an heir: handsome, athletic, confident, and fiercely competitive. He was also, by many accounts, a near-perfect reflection of his father's personality: brash, sometimes arrogant, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. Unlike his more charming and witty younger brother, Joe Jr. could be domineering. He expected to lead and often pulled rank on his siblings, especially Jack, whom he saw as his chief rival. Their competitions were legendary, from sailing races off the coast of Cape Cod to brutal games of touch football on the lawn, contests that often ended with injuries and bruised egos. One famous story perfectly captures their dynamic. During a sailing race, Joe Jr., an excellent sailor, found himself being outmaneuvered by a cleverer, more intuitive Jack. Rather than accept second place, Joe Jr. became enraged and deliberately capsized his own boat, choosing to sink rather than suffer the indignity of being beaten. Joe Jr. almost always won, and he made sure everyone knew it. He followed the path laid out for him perfectly, attending the London School of Economics, graduating from Harvard, serving as a delegate to the 1940 Democratic National Convention, and entering Harvard Law, seemingly destined for a towering political career. But the outbreak of World War II changed everything. Joe Jr. enlisted as a naval aviator, flying patrol bombers in the Atlantic. He successfully completed his required 25 missions, a dangerous tour of duty that had reportedly left him more somber and less of the cocksure young man who had left home. He had fulfilled his obligation. He could have left the war with honor, but back home, his younger brother Jack had become a national sensation. After the Japanese destroyer Amagiri rammed and sank his vessel, PT-109, Jack's heroic efforts to save his surviving crewmen had turned him into a celebrated war hero, complete with a fawning article in the New Yorker. For Joe Jr., ever the competitor, his brother's fame was an unbearable challenge to his position as the family's star. He couldn't stand being outdone. Driven by a burning need to reclaim the spotlight and prove his own valor, he ignored the pleas of his family and extended his tour, volunteering for a top-secret and incredibly dangerous mission in 1944, known as Operation Aphrodite. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. In essence, it was the world's first drone program, but with a horrifyingly primitive and unreliable design. Pilots were to take off in B-24 Liberator bombers that had been stripped of everything non-essential and packed to the brim with 21,170 pounds of Torpex, an explosive 50% more powerful than TNT. These planes were effectively flying bombs. The two-man crew's job was to get the plane airborne, establish a remote control link with a mothership, and then parachute out over the English Channel, while the drone was guided to its target, heavily fortified German V-2 rocket sites in France. It was a mission with an extraordinarily high risk of failure. Of the 14 such missions flown under the program, none successfully hit their intended target, and 4 pilots were killed. The remote control technology was notoriously buggy, and the electronic arming system for the tons of explosives was frighteningly unstable, requiring the crew to manually plug in fuses while in midair. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Wilford Willey, took off in their explosive-packed aircraft over the English countryside. They were beginning the delicate process of arming the explosives when, for reasons that will never be known, the entire payload detonated. Two massive explosions, witnessed by horrified crewmen in nearby planes, lit up the sky. The plane disintegrated in a massive fireball, killing Joe Jr. instantly at the age of 29. His body was never recovered. The news shattered the family, particularly his father, who fell into a deep and inconsolable grief. The designated heir was gone, and with his death, the entire weight of the Kennedy dynasty, its hopes, its dreams, its relentless ambition, was transferred onto the shoulders of the second son, John. A single tragic explosion didn't just end a life, it irrevocably altered the course of American history. While Joe Jr.'s fate was sealed by the ambitions of war, his sister Rosemary's was determined by a quieter, more insidious battle fought within the family's own walls. Born in 1918, Rosemary was the third Kennedy child and the first daughter. Her birth was complicated. A nurse waiting for the doctor to arrive reportedly instructed Rose to delay the delivery for 2 hours, resulting in a prolonged period of oxygen deprivation for the newborn. As Rosemary grew, it became clear she was different. She was slower to walk and talk than her siblings, and she struggled in school, unable to keep up in the family's fiercely competitive environment. Her diary entries from her teenage years, written in a large childlike script, are heartbreakingly poignant. She wrote of her struggles with reading and math, her desire to please her parents, and her frustration at always being left behind. "I would do anything to be smart," she once wrote. Today she would likely be diagnosed with a mild intellectual disability, but in the early 20th century, her condition was a source of private shame and a potential threat to the family's pristine public image. Despite her challenges, Rosemary was described as a sweet and beautiful young woman. When her father was ambassador, she was presented to the king and queen at Buckingham Palace, a fairy tale moment for the shy girl who loved pretty dresses. Dressed in a stunning white tulle gown, she was coached for hours by her mother and sisters on the intricate curtsy. They were terrified she would stumble or make a mistake, but when the moment came, she performed it perfectly. For a brief period, she thrived, attending dances and parties and enjoying the life of a debutante. Her letters from this time are filled with joy. But as she entered her 20s, her intellectual limitations became more pronounced, and she began to experience severe mood swings and emotional outbursts. Back in the United States, her frustration grew as she watched her siblings surpass her and lead exciting, independent lives. She reportedly began sneaking out of the convent school where she was living, meeting men in local bars. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was likely a desperate cry for connection and normalcy. But for Joseph Kennedy Sr., a man obsessed with image and control, this was his worst nightmare. He wasn't just worried about her well-being. He was terrified of a potential pregnancy or a sexual scandal that could derail the political careers he was so meticulously planning for his sons. In 1941, without consulting his wife or his other children, Joe Sr. made a secret, unilateral decision that would condemn his daughter to a lifetime of silence. He had heard of a miraculous new procedure that promised to cure mental illness and calm unruly behavior, a procedure that was being hailed by some in the medical community as a revolutionary breakthrough. He arranged for 23-year-old Rosemary to undergo one of the most brutal and imprecise procedures in medical history, a prefrontal lobotomy. The surgeon, Dr. Walter Freeman, was a crusading evangelist for the operation, a showman who traveled the country in a van he called the lobotomobile. He infamously performed the procedure using an instrument that resembled a butter knife, which he would insert through the patient's eye sockets and wiggle back and forth to sever the connections in the brain's frontal lobe. The patient was awake the entire time. According to his partner, Dr. James Watts, who was present at Rosemary's surgery, they kept her conscious, asking her to sing songs or recite prayers. They only stopped cutting when her speech became incoherent. The result was an absolute catastrophe. The operation didn't calm Rosemary. It destroyed her. It took away her anger and her anxiety, but it also took away everything else. It left her with the mental capacity of a toddler, unable to walk or speak coherently, and incontinent for the rest of her life. The vibrant young woman who loved to dance was gone, replaced by a vacant shell. The procedure that had been meant to fix her had erased her. In the aftermath, Rosemary Kennedy simply disappeared. Her father, horrified at what he had done, immediately had her institutionalized, first at a psychiatric hospital in upstate New York, and then permanently at St. Coletta, a private Catholic facility in Jefferson, Wisconsin. For 20 years, she was completely hidden from the public and even from most of her own family. The official story, meticulously maintained, was that she was reclusive and had dedicated her life to teaching disabled children in the Midwest. Her siblings were discouraged from asking questions, and for years they didn't. Her existence was effectively erased to protect the Kennedy name. In a heartbreaking admission years later, it was revealed that her mother, Rose, did not visit her for 2 full decades. Joe Sr. never saw her again. When he had a debilitating stroke in 1961, his children finally learned the full, horrifying truth of what had happened to their sister. In his memoir, Ted Kennedy wrote about the profound guilt the family felt, calling the lobotomy a jolt that shattered their image of their father's infallibility. Rosemary, the young woman who once danced with dukes, became the family's darkest secret, a living ghost sacrificed for political ambition. Her tragic story only came to light years later, after her father's death, inspiring her sister Eunice to found the Special Olympics and become a global champion for people with intellectual disabilities, a beautiful legacy born from an almost unthinkable family tragedy. While Rosemary's story is one of forced conformity, her younger sister Kathleen's is one of spirited rebellion. Known to everyone as Kick, she was by all accounts the most vivacious, charming, and independent of the Kennedy children. Born in 1920, she possessed an infectious energy, a quick wit, and a rebellious streak that often put her at odds with her family's rigid expectations, particularly the strict Catholic piety of her mother, Rose. She was the family's ray of sunshine, but one with a mischievous glint in her eye, a stark contrast to the more serious-minded siblings, who were focused on the dynastic ambitions laid out by their father. When her father was appointed the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1938, the 18-year-old Kick took London by storm. Pre-war British society was a world of rigid formality and ancient traditions, and into this somewhat stuffy environment burst Kick, a whirlwind of American informality. She was an instant sensation, adored for her unpretentious charm and her lively personality. Where her mother Rose sometimes struggled with the stiff etiquette of the English court, Kick thrived, treating everyone with the same breezy familiarity. She used American slang that baffled and delighted the aristocracy, had a habit of casually kicking the shins of people she liked, the very origin of her nickname, and possessed a democratic spirit that saw her befriend dukes, journalists, and butlers with equal enthusiasm. She was presented at court, a grand ceremony requiring a white gown, ostrich feathers, and a complex curtsy before the king and queen, yet she maintained her down-to-earth demeanor. She even began writing a witty gossip and society column for the Washington Times-Herald under a pseudonym, offering American readers a funny insider's look at the British elite as they faced the looming threat of war. She wrote about their notoriously cold country houses and their peculiar love of gossip, observing it all with a sharp, intelligent eye. She became a darling of the press, who named her the debutante of 1938 and a fixture in the Cliveden set, the influential social circle of the era. This was a unique moment in history, a time of great tension and a live-for-today attitude among the young aristocrats, which perfectly suited Kick's effervescent nature. Kick wasn't just visiting London, she was conquering it. She fell deeply in love with the city, its traditions, and more significantly, with a man who seemed to embody the very soul of the English establishment, William Cavendish, the Marquis of Hartington. Known to his friends as Billy, he was the opposite of the brash, competitive Kennedy man Kick had grown up with. He was quiet, modest, thoughtful, and deeply honorable, the heir to one of England's most powerful and storied noble families, the Dukes of Devonshire. Their courtship wasn't just a whirlwind of society balls. It deepened during quiet weekends at Chatsworth, the spectacular Devonshire country estate where they would take long walks and discuss politics, books, and the ever-growing threat of war in Europe. Billy was reportedly captivated by her intelligence and her refreshingly candid opinions, qualities not always encouraged in the young aristocratic women of his circle. Their romance blossomed against the darkening backdrop of the looming war, a connection of genuine affection and intellectual respect that gave them both a sense of stability in an unstable world. It was a true meeting of minds and hearts, but Billy represented everything her family opposed. He was not only a Protestant, but a pillar of the Anglican Church. This was not merely a matter of attending a different church on Sundays. As the future Duke of Devonshire, Billy would be the head of a vast estate and a key figure in the Church of England, with responsibilities to his community and his title that were centuries old. The fairy tale romance was about to collide with the unyielding realities of faith, duty, and family, setting the stage for the central conflict of Kick's young life. For the Kennedys, an Irish Catholic family that had fought for generations to gain acceptance in a Protestant-dominated world, the idea of their daughter marrying into the highest echelons of the British aristocracy was thrilling. You have to understand what this meant. This wasn't just about marrying a rich man, it was about conquering a social Everest. Back in Boston, the Kennedys were still seen by the old, money Protestant families, the so-called Boston Brahmins, as little more than lace-curtain Irish, upstarts with new money, but no real pedigree. Joe Sr. had broken barriers in business and politics, but the invisible walls of social class remained. A marriage to the heir of the Duke of Devonshire wasn't just a good match. It was a symbolic victory, a final arrival into a world that had for so long looked down on them. It was a social victory that even Joe Sr., in all his ambition, could hardly have imagined. But his religion, the very core of their Irish identity, was an insurmountable obstacle. And for his wife, Rose Kennedy, this wasn't about social status, it was about salvation. Rose's Catholicism was the bedrock of her existence, a formidable and unwavering force that governed her every thought and action. It was a faith of saints and sinners, of heaven and hell, with very little room for compromise in between. In her eyes, steeped in a devout and unforgiving Catholicism, marrying a Protestant meant risking eternal damnation for her daughter's soul. It was a spiritual stain that no title or castle could ever wash away. This conviction was woven with the threads of history. The historical memory of Irish suffering at the hands of the Protestant English was deeply ingrained in her, a visceral part of her identity. It was a story of penal laws that forbade Catholics from owning land or practicing their faith, of the great famine that her own ancestors had fled, and of a centuries-long struggle for freedom. To Rose, the Church of England wasn't just another denomination. It was the symbol of the crown, the institution of the oppressor. And so she saw Kick's choice as a betrayal of their heritage and their faith. She fought the marriage with everything she had, launching a campaign of maternal and spiritual warfare across the Atlantic. The letters started arriving in a relentless flood. At first they were pleading, filled with prayers and professions of a mother's undying love, begging Kick to reconsider, to come home, to save her immortal soul. When the pleading failed to move her daughter, the tone shifted. There were threats of disownment, warnings that she would be cut off from the family, a ghost in their lives. Rose began bombarding Kick with spiritual propaganda, newspaper clippings about the sorrowful lives of women in mixed marriages, pamphlets from priests on the sin of apostasy, and long handwritten letters filled with a potent combination of spiritual anguish and maternal despair. She described her sleepless nights, her constant prayers before the crucifix, painting a vivid picture of a mother's heart being broken by her daughter's choices. Joe Jr., the staunchly Catholic older brother, was also fiercely opposed. As the eldest son, he was the vessel of all his father's dynastic hopes, the one destined for the White House. He saw Kick's marriage not just as a spiritual failure, but as a political liability. He wrote to his sister in stark, almost cold terms, arguing that she was disgracing the family name and jeopardizing their political future. How could the Kennedys rally the crucial Irish Catholic vote in America if one of their own had married into the English Protestant aristocracy? To him, it was an act of profound selfishness that threatened to derail the entire Kennedy project. Kick was left profoundly isolated, caught between the man she loved and the family she adored. She was in a foreign country, navigating the complex codes of the English upper class while fighting a deeply personal war with her own family an ocean away. The long-distance phone calls were fraught with tension, the static on the transatlantic line a fitting metaphor for the communication breakdown. She sought a compromise from the Vatican, clinging to the hope that a special dispensation could be found, a path that would allow her to keep both her faith and her love. But the church was unyielding, its ancient laws as inflexible as stone. The answer that came back was definitive. She could marry Billy, but any children born of the union had to be raised Catholic. For Billy, the future Duke of Devonshire, this was an impossible condition. This wasn't about personal religious bigotry. It was about a duty that was centuries old. The heir to his title was traditionally the head of the local Anglican community, a patron and protector of the Church of England in their vast domain. To agree that his own son and heir would be raised in the Roman Catholic faith was to break a sacred trust with his family, his heritage, and his future tenants. It was a complete non-starter. The choice was absolute. There would be no compromise. Despite the immense pressure and the pain of her mother's disapproval, she chose love. In May 1944, she married Billy Hardington in a simple civil ceremony at a registry office in Chelsea. The bride wore a simple pink dress, a quiet defiance of the traditional white she could not wear in a church. It was a stark, uncelebrated affair for a union of two such prominent families. The setting was drab and bureaucratic, a world away from the soaring arches of Westminster Abbey, where a wedding of this social magnitude should have taken place. There were no bridesmaids, no groomsmen, no joyous crowd of well-wishers. None of her family attended except for her father. Joe Sr., ever the pragmatist, was torn. For months, while he shared his wife's religious concerns, he also recognized the immense social and political prestige of the match. His mind saw the strategic value, while his heart ached for the family schism it was causing. In a last-ditch effort, he had even secretly met with an archbishop to try and find a loophole, some obscure clause in canon law that could grant a special permission. When none was found, he faced his own final choice, dogma or daughter. He chose his daughter. He flew across the dangerous U-boat patrolled Atlantic to be there. He walked his daughter down the aisle, a solitary figure representing a family deeply fractured by his daughter's choice. His presence was a silent testament of a father's love, but it also underscored the profound emptiness left by the absence of her mother, brothers, and sisters. Their happiness, however, was tragically brief. World War II was raging across Europe, and Billy, an officer in the Coldstream Guards, was deployed to the front lines in France just 5 weeks after their wedding. Kik moved into one of the Devonshire family's grand estates, Lismore Castle in Ireland, and waited anxiously for letters from her husband. She found herself in a strange irony, an Irish-American Kennedy living in a castle that was a potent symbol of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy her ancestors had fought against. Her days fell into a routine of anxious hope, every footstep of the postman sending her heart racing. Just 4 months after their wedding, the devastating news arrived. It came via phone call to Chatsworth, the Devonshire family seat. Billy had been killed in action in Belgium, shot through the heart by a German sniper while leading his men. He was gone in an instant. Kik, now the Dowager Marchioness of Hartington, was a widow at 24, alone in a foreign country. The title she had sacrificed so much for was now a brand of her loss. Though heartbroken, she showed incredible resilience. In the depths of her grief, she was embraced by her late husband's family, particularly her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Devonshire. The Duchess, reeling from the loss of her own firstborn son and heir, saw in Kik not an outsider, but the woman who had made Billy so happy. Grieving the loss of her own son, she grew to love the vibrant American girl as her own daughter. They found solace in each other's company at the grand family seat, Chatsworth. They would walk together for hours through the vast manicured gardens, two women from different worlds and different faiths, united by a common crushing sorrow. The Duchess would ask Kik to tell her stories of Billy, finding comfort in the fresh memories of a love she had only witnessed for a short time. This powerful new bond, forged in tragedy, gave Kik a sense of belonging she had never known before. She remained in England, a society she had come to adore and that had embraced her as one of its own. In the years after the war, as Britain began to rebuild itself, she became a central figure in London's social scene. But she was much more than a mere socialite. She became known for her wit, intelligence, and the lively political discussion she hosted in her home. Her apartment became a fashionable salon, a place where the new generation of Labour politicians could argue with old-guard Tories, where journalists, artists, and aristocrats could mingle freely. She had an innate political sense, inherited from her father, and a charm that was all her own. She had built a life for herself independent of her family's name and expectations, becoming not just Lady Hartington, but a unique and respected force in her adopted homeland. A few years later, she found love again with another powerful Englishman, Lord Peter Fitzwilliam. He was everything Billy Hartington was not: dashing, immensely wealthy, a decorated war hero with a reputation for living life on the edge, a notorious gambler, and a well-known womanizer. Theirs was a passionate whirlwind romance, a life of high-stakes card games in London's most exclusive clubs and glamorous trips to the Irish horse races. He was also, like her late husband, a Protestant. To make matters worse in her family's eyes, he was a married man in the process of a divorce, which in the eyes of the Catholic Church was an unforgivable sin. This relationship caused the final rupture with her mother. Rose saw it as Kik spiraling even further away from the church and into a life of public scandal. In her letters to her other children, Rose expressed her profound sorrow, viewing Kik as a lost soul. She effectively cut off communication, plunging her daughter into a deep despair. Kik's own letters to her brother Jack during this time reveal a young woman in turmoil, deeply in love but terrified of being permanently excommunicated from her family and faith, even considering foregoing marriage to Fitzwilliam just to appease her mother. In May 1948, Kik and Lord Fitzwilliam boarded a small twin-engine de Havilland Dove plane to head for a vacation on the French Riviera, where Kik was to meet his family. They were warned not to fly. A massive storm was brewing over the continent. But Fitzwilliam, ever the risk-taker, insisted they could fly under it. They flew directly into it. Eyewitnesses on the ground in the remote French countryside later reported seeing the small plane struggling valiantly against the violent winds before it disappeared into the dark clouds. The tiny plane was caught in violent turbulence and, according to the accident report, likely suffered a structural failure as it was torn apart in midair, crashing into the side of a mountain in southern France. Everyone on board was killed instantly. Kik was just 28 years old. In a final heartbreaking testament to the family rift her choices had caused, only one Kennedy family member traveled to England for her funeral, her father, Joe Sr. He stood alone in the rain at a small Catholic church in Edensor, the village on the Devonshire estate, as the British aristocracy gathered to mourn the young woman they had adopted as their own. The Devonshires, her English family, arranged the entire service. Joe Kennedy's solitude was a stark visual representation of the chasm that had opened between Kik and her American family. It fell to him to sort through her belongings, where he found the unanswered letters from her mother, tangible proof of the unresolved anguish that marked her final years. He watched as his vibrant, rebellious daughter was laid to rest far from home, buried in the Cavendish family plot next to the husband for whom she had sacrificed so much. Her tombstone reads, "Joy she gave, joy she has found," a poignant epitaph for the daughter who dared to live and love on her own terms, a symbol of the clash between personal freedom and the unforgiving demands of a dynasty. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 didn't just rob a nation of its leaders, they inflicted a deep and lasting trauma on the next generation of the family. The bright promise of Camelot gave way to a darker reality, where the Kennedy name became synonymous not just with power, but with profound and violent loss. For the 11 children of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, who grew up at their chaotic, loving home at Hickory Hill in Virginia, the public spectacle of their father's death became a private burden that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. After RFK's death, Ethel was left to raise their enormous brood alone, a task that would have been daunting for anyone. She was a woman of incredible strength, but she was also consumed by her own bottomless grief. The home that had once been the vibrant center of political strategy and filled with the joyous noise of a massive family lost its center of gravity. The house remained filled with people, pets, and a constant flurry of activity, almost as if the sheer volume of life could somehow fill the profound, unspoken void their father had left. In the ensuing chaos, with a grieving mother and no father figure to enforce discipline, the atmosphere at Hickory Hill became dangerously permissive. A cult of heroism grew around RFK's memory. The children were expected to be brave, stoic carriers of his legacy, a monumental weight for any child to bear. Some of the older children, now teenagers, were left to navigate their sorrow with little supervision, in a home where their private grief was constantly interrupted by a stream of famous visitors who came to pay their respects. This created a strange, isolating bubble of privilege and tragedy, an environment where some of the children felt adrift. Two of Robert and Ethel's sons, David and Michael, would find their lives defined and ultimately destroyed by the echoes of that trauma and the pressures of their inheritance. David A. Kennedy was the fourth of RFK's 11 children, a sensitive, quiet, and introspective boy who idolized his father. On the night of June 5, 1968, 12-year-old David was alone in a Los Angeles hotel room, watching on television as his father claimed victory in the California presidential primary. He watched the joyous scenes from the Ambassador Hotel ballroom, the cheering crowds, the hopeful speech, and then, in a horrifying live broadcast, he saw the image switch to the frantic, terrifying chaos of the hotel's kitchen pantry. He saw the confusion and heard the screams that erupted after his father was shot. That moment of televised horror, the violent severing of a celebration, became the defining trauma of David's life. He never truly recovered. The profound grief was compounded by a sense of isolation within his large, boisterous family. In a clan that valued toughness and stoicism, David's quiet sensitivity was often misunderstood. While his siblings processed their grief through action, he internalized it, obsessively compiling a scrapbook of his father's life and death, a desperate attempt to hold on to his memory. A year after his father's death, he nearly drowned in the rough ocean currents off Malibu and had to be rescued by his father's close friend, Lem Billings. The incident seemed to deepen his sense of fragility and fear. In the years that followed, he began a long and painful descent into drug addiction, seeking in heroin a temporary escape from the psychological pain that never left him. To many observers, the lack of legal consequences wasn't proof of innocence, but rather another galling example of the Kennedys closing ranks and using their influence to protect one of their own. The scandal destroyed Michael's marriage and derailed his career. His wife, Victoria, was publicly humiliated and filed for divorce. He was forced to step down from his position at Citizens Energy. In a matter of months, he had lost his family, his career, and his public reputation. He went from being a respected community leader to a national pariah, a symbol of Kennedy entitlement run amok. He was reportedly ostracized by some members of his own family, becoming an outcast in the clan that valued public image above all else. During this period, he reportedly entered rehab for alcoholism, a man clearly struggling with profound personal demons. His life, once so full of promise, began to spiral out of control. The final tragic act came just months later during the family's annual Christmas vacation in Aspen, Colorado. The holiday was reportedly tense, an attempt to maintain a facade of family unity while the raw wounds of the scandal were still festering. On New Year's Eve, Michael and several relatives were playing their famously aggressive and high-risk game of touch football on skis as dusk fell on the slopes of Aspen Mountain. This wasn't a casual toss-around. It was a high-speed, high-impact tradition, a ritual of masculine bonding, and a way for the Kennedy men to prove their toughness and daring. For Michael, stripped of his professional standing and his role as a husband, this dangerous game may have felt like the only arena he had left to prove he was still a true Kennedy. The conditions were icy, the light was fading, but they played on. Despite warnings from the ski patrol about the dangerous conditions, they continued their reckless game. His brother RFK Jr. reportedly warned him just moments before the crash that it was getting too dangerous. But Michael, perhaps in a desperate, nihilistic attempt to reclaim his place in the family's macho culture after his public shaming, played on. While attempting to catch a pass, Michael, who was not wearing a helmet or goggles, swerved and crashed headfirst into a tree in front of several of his horrified family members, including some of his own children. He was killed instantly. He was 39 years old. His death was seen not merely as a tragic accident, but as the culmination of a life of privilege and poor judgment, a final fatal act of recklessness. For many, Michael's death symbolized a darker side of the Kennedy legacy, a sense of entitlement and an immunity to consequences that could and ultimately did lead to self-destruction. By the 1990s, the Kennedy mystique was facing a new kind of challenge. The fourth generation, born into immense wealth and a legendary name, had to navigate a world that was far more skeptical and media-saturated than the one their grandparents had conquered. The deference once afforded to the family was gone, replaced by intense scrutiny. This new reality came to a head in 1991 with a scandal that would once again drag the family's private behavior into the harsh glare of the public spotlight and force a national conversation about privilege, consent, and accountability. This was happening against a backdrop of immense cultural change. The Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings were about to grip the nation, bringing the issues of sexual harassment and the power dynamics between men and women to the forefront of public consciousness. The William Kennedy Smith trial would land like a lightning bolt in the middle of this cultural storm, becoming a defining moment of the era. The stage for this drama was La Garita, the sprawling Kennedy estate in Palm Beach, Florida. It was a place steeped in Kennedy lore, the glamorous winter White House during JFK's presidency, but also a private playground where the family's more hedonistic tendencies were given free rein. On the evening of Good Friday, 1991, the mood at the compound was reportedly somber. Senator Ted Kennedy, the family's aging patriarch, was said to be despondent over a recent scathing magazine profile that had dredged up his past scandals. Seeking a distraction, he decided on a late-night excursion. Around 11:30 p.m., he roused his son Patrick and his nephew William Kennedy Smith from their beds. Their destination was Al Bar, a fashionable and exclusive nightclub in Palm Beach, a place to see and be seen among the wealthy elite. The impromptu, alcohol-fueled outing felt less like a celebration and more like an entitled escape, a pattern of behavior that would soon come under a microscope. William Kennedy Smith, the son of Gene Kennedy Smith and a nephew of JFK, was a medical student at Georgetown University in his early 30s. To many observers, the lack of legal consequences wasn't proof of innocence, but rather another galling example of the Kennedys closing ranks and using their influence to protect one of their own. The scandal destroyed Michael's marriage and derailed his career. His wife, Victoria, was publicly humiliated and filed for divorce. He was forced to step down from his position at Citizens Energy. In a matter of months, he had lost his family, his career, and his public reputation. He went from being a respected community leader to a national pariah, a symbol of Kennedy entitlement run amok. He was reportedly ostracized by some members of his own family, becoming an outcast in the clan that valued public image above all else. During this period, he reportedly entered rehab for alcoholism, a man clearly struggling with profound personal demons. His life, once so full of promise, began to spiral out of control. The final tragic act came just months later during the family's annual Christmas vacation in Aspen, Colorado. The holiday was reportedly tense, an attempt to maintain a facade of family unity while the raw wounds of the scandal were still festering. On New Year's Eve, Michael and several relatives were playing their famously aggressive and high-risk game of touch football on skis as dusk fell on the slopes of Aspen Mountain. This wasn't a casual toss-around. It was a high-speed, high-impact tradition, a ritual of masculine bonding, and a way for the Kennedy men to prove their toughness and daring. For Michael, stripped of his professional standing and his role as a husband, this dangerous game may have felt like the only arena he had left to prove he was still a true Kennedy. The conditions were icy, the light was fading, but they played on. Despite warnings from the ski patrol about the dangerous conditions, they continued their reckless game. His brother RFK Jr. reportedly warned him just moments before the crash that it was getting too dangerous. But Michael, perhaps in a desperate, nihilistic attempt to reclaim his place in the family's macho culture after his public shaming, played on. While attempting to catch a pass, Michael, who was not wearing a helmet or goggles, swerved and crashed headfirst into a tree in front of several of his horrified family members, including some of his own children. He was killed instantly. He was 39 years old. His death was seen not merely as a tragic accident, but as the culmination of a life of privilege and poor judgment, a final fatal act of recklessness. For many, Michael's death symbolized a darker side of the Kennedy legacy, a sense of entitlement and an immunity to consequences that could and ultimately did lead to self-destruction. By the 1990s, the Kennedy mystique was facing a new kind of challenge. The fourth generation, born into immense wealth and a legendary name, had to navigate a world that was far more skeptical and media-saturated than the one their grandparents had conquered. The deference once afforded to the family was gone, replaced by intense scrutiny. This new reality came to a head in 1991 with a scandal that would once again drag the family's private behavior into the harsh glare of the public spotlight and force a national conversation about privilege, consent, and accountability. This was happening against a backdrop of immense cultural change. The Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings were about to grip the nation, bringing the issues of sexual harassment and the power dynamics between men and women to the forefront of public consciousness. The William Kennedy Smith trial would land like a lightning bolt in the middle of this cultural storm, becoming a defining moment of the era. The stage for this drama was La Garita, the sprawling Kennedy estate in Palm Beach, Florida. It was a place steeped in Kennedy lore, the glamorous winter White House during JFK's presidency, but also a private playground where the family's more hedonistic tendencies were given free rein. On the evening of Good Friday, 1991, the mood at the compound was reportedly somber. Senator Ted Kennedy, the family's aging patriarch, was said to be despondent over a recent scathing magazine profile that had dredged up his past scandals. Seeking a distraction, he decided on a late-night excursion. Around 11:30 p.m., he roused his son Patrick and his nephew William Kennedy Smith from their beds. Their destination was Al Bar, a fashionable and exclusive nightclub in Palm Beach, a place to see and be seen among the wealthy elite. The impromptu, alcohol-fueled outing felt less like a celebration and more like an entitled escape, a pattern of behavior that would soon come under a microscope. William Kennedy Smith, the son of Gene Kennedy Smith and a nephew of JFK, was a medical student at Georgetown University in his early 30s. Unlike some of his cousins, he was not a political figure and had largely avoided the scandalous headlines that seemed to follow the family. He was generally considered one of the more serious and responsible members of his generation, which made the subsequent accusation all the more shocking. His uncle, Senator Ted Kennedy, was a different story. He was a man whose career was forever shadowed by the 1969 Chappaquiddick incident, where a young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, died after he drove his car off a bridge and failed to report the accident for 10 hours. In the decades since, his reputation for hard drinking and womanizing had become legendary. His presence that night added a layer of historical weight to the events that unfolded, instantly transforming a private matter into a national story freighted with the baggage of the past. The evening began at La Garita, the family's sprawling Palm Beach estate. It was the Kennedy Fortress, a place of immense power and privacy where the family felt they could operate by their own rules. On that Good Friday in 1991, Ted Kennedy was reportedly stewing over a recent, deeply critical profile in GQ magazine titled The Last Brother, which had painted him as a man in decline, haunted by his past. Seeking an escape, he roused his son, Patrick, and his nephew, William, from their beds for a late-night trip to a local bar. Their destination was Al Bar, an exclusive nightclub where the wealthy elite of Palm Beach mingled. After a few hours of drinking, William Smith met Patricia Bowman, a 29-year-old single mother. They talked, they danced, and at the end of the night, she agreed to drive him back to the Kennedy compound. What happened next would become the subject of one of the most sensational trials of the 20th century. Later that night, in a frantic 911 call, she accused him of chasing her through the mansion, tackling her on the dark oceanside lawn, and brutally raping her. The accusation was explosive. When police arrived at the Kennedy compound, they were met not with cooperation, but with the well-practiced Kennedy playbook for damage control. Lawyers were on the scene almost immediately. Ted Kennedy was evasive, initially refusing to give a formal statement and delaying police efforts to interview his nephew. This stonewalling, so reminiscent of the Chappaquiddick cover-up, instantly fueled public suspicion and set the tone for the media firestorm to come. The subsequent trial became a national spectacle. The case dredged up every dark rumor and past controversy associated with the family. The trial wasn't just about one man's guilt or innocence. It became a referendum on the Kennedy men's perceived culture of womanizing, entitlement, and using their immense power to evade responsibility. The media descended on Palm Beach with satellite trucks lining the streets, and networks like CNN provided gavel-to-gavel coverage, turning the courtroom proceedings into a national soap opera. It was one of the first major trials of the 24-hour news cycle era, a precursor to the O.J. Simpson trial that would follow a few years later. The public was given a front row seat to the family's inner world, and the details that emerged were unflattering, painting a picture of a decadent lifestyle far removed from the ideals of public service. The trial became a staple of late-night television, with comedians mercilessly satirizing the family, marking a significant moment where the Kennedys transitioned from being figures of reverence and tragedy to objects of public ridicule. The trial was broadcast live on television, offering an unfiltered look into the Kennedy world. Inside the courtroom, the drama was intense. The prosecution, led by Moira Lash, argued that it was a classic case of a powerful man who believed his name and status gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. Patricia Bowman, whose face was famously obscured by a large blue dot on television to protect her identity, a symbol that itself became iconic of the media frenzy, gave emotional taped testimony describing a violent assault. William Kennedy Smith, however, proved to be an exceptionally poised and convincing witness in his own defense. He took the stand and, in a calm, articulate manner, presented himself as a gentle, wrongly accused man who had engaged in a consensual act, an encounter he claimed she had initiated and later regretted. The defense team, led by famed Miami attorney Roy Black, mounted a powerful and aggressive defense. In an era before the Me Too movement had shifted public consciousness, Black employed a classic strategy. He put the accuser on trial. He systematically attacked Patricia Bowman's character and credibility, portraying her as a single mother with a troubled past, citing a poor driving record, a child born out of wedlock, and a supposedly promiscuous lifestyle. These details, while legally irrelevant to the question of consent, were devastatingly effective in the court of public opinion. He presented a compelling counter-narrative of a star-struck woman who had willingly gone back to the Kennedy compound, regretted a consensual encounter, and then cried rape. Key testimony from Bowman's friend who had been with her at the bar seemed to contradict parts of her story, and the lack of physical evidence of a violent struggle further muddying the waters for the prosecution. Despite a vigorous defense that painted the accuser's story as inconsistent, the damage to the family's reputation was immense. The spectacle of a Kennedy on trial, with the family's dirty laundry being aired for the world to see, was a shocking fall from grace. William Kennedy Smith was ultimately acquitted of all charges after the jury deliberated for just 77 minutes. The swift verdict was a stunning legal victory for the defense. However, it did little to erase the sordid image presented during the proceedings. For many Americans, the acquittal confirmed their deepest suspicions that there was one system of justice for the rich and powerful and another for everyone else. The trial laid bare a lifestyle of casual indulgence and privilege that seemed starkly at odds with the family's carefully crafted image of public service. It reinforced a narrative that had haunted them for decades, that for some Kennedys, the rules simply did not apply. The scandal severely tarnished the family's legacy for a new generation, marking the definitive end of the Camelot era's innocence. For Ted Kennedy, the public humiliation was a profound wake-up call. He later gave a famous speech at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, publicly acknowledging his personal shortcomings and the need for self-reflection. While many were skeptical, his subsequent years in the Senate were marked by a renewed focus and dedication, suggesting the scandal may have forced a necessary reckoning. For William Kennedy Smith, though legally exonerated, the trial cast a long shadow over his life. He went on to become a physician, dedicating his career to working with landmine victims, a life of quiet service that stood in stark contrast to the notoriety of his youth. The trial was a powerful reminder that in modern America, not even the Kennedy name could shield its members from public judgment, and that the court of public opinion could render a verdict far more lasting than any jury. When we look back at the sprawling saga of the Kennedy family, it's easy to be captivated by the light, by the charismatic president, the noble public servants, the enduring myth of Camelot. But as we've seen, that light casts long and unforgiving shadows. The stories of Joe Jr., Rosemary, Kick, David, Michael, and William Smith are not mere footnotes to a grander narrative. They are the narrative. They reveal the profound human cost of building and sustaining an American dynasty. Their lives illustrate the collision of immense privilege with unbearable pressure, of public expectation with private pain. For every Kennedy who reached the heights of power, it seems another paid a terrible price. Of course, not every sibling's story ended in such dramatic tragedy. Lives like those of Patricia Kennedy Lawford, who struggled with alcoholism in the shadow of her famous brothers, and actor husband Peter Lawford, or Gene Kennedy Smith, who found purpose late in life as a respected ambassador to Ireland, show that there were many shades of gray within the family's experience. But the sheer concentration of calamity is impossible to ignore. These are the stories of a son who died chasing a hero's glory, a daughter erased to preserve a perfect image, and another who died after choosing love over duty. They are the stories of a generation haunted by assassination, driven to self-destruction by inherited trauma and reckless behavior. And they are the story of how a legendary name became both a shield and a target. Was it a curse? Or was it simply the tragic, inevitable result of a family that flew too close to the sun for too long, Their ambition so vast it eventually consumed some of their own? Perhaps the curse was never a mystical force, but rather the very human and predictable outcome of immense wealth, unchecked power, and the crushing expectation to be more than human, to be Kennedys. In the end, the Kennedy legacy is a complex tapestry woven with threads of both triumph and tragedy. The family endures, but it is changed. The focus has shifted from overt political power to philanthropy and quieter forms of public service. A legacy perhaps best embodied by Eunice Shriver's Special Olympics, an organization born from the ashes of her sister's silent suffering. The name still opens doors, but it now carries with it this heavy cautionary history. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is a deeply human one, that behind the gilded facade of every great house, there are hidden rooms of sorrow, and that the pursuit of immortality often demands a mortal price. The story of the Kennedys is not just a story of power, it is a profound and poignant reminder of the fragility of life, even for those who seem to have it all.